Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm Dan Slater, the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies at UMich Democracy. This is a kind of a new format that we're experimenting with today. We're really excited about. So we have been, since 2019, we've been publishing a book series, the Emerging Democracies book series with University of Michigan Press. And so what we want to start doing each semester is bring out some authors from the series whose books are on some similar themes and get them in conversation, talking not just about their books in the series, but also their ongoing work. And again, thinking some creative ways about how their work speaks to each other. So we have some really, really terrific scholars who've been publishing the series and who we've brought out today. So the theme for today is elections against the grain. And the basic idea here is that we tend to believe that elections are ways that voters can hold politicians accountable, but it's not always so straightforward. And one thing that unites all three of our authors here today is they all give us ways of, I would argue, thinking about elections against the grain and thinking some different ways about ways in which elections might not do what we're raised and reared to believe that they do. So things like the way that strategic boycotts, authoritarian restrictions, incumbent biases, variety of ways that elections might not serve their what we think of as their intended purpose. And then I think at a deeper level, I think should all make us wonder, in a time when a lot of very undemocratic politicians are winning elections, how much democracy is really about elections versus other things. So that's kind of the broad remit for the session. But let me just briefly introduce our three authors and our speakers today before we get going. So first, Mollie Cohen. Mollie is an associate professor of political science at Purdue University. Previously, she was an assistant professor of international affairs at the University of Georgia and a research fellow at the LAPOP Lab. She received her PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Cohen studies public opinion and voting behavior, especially in Latin America. Her book, None of the Above, Protest Voting in Latin American Democracies, examines how democratic backsliding fuels the emergence and success of campaigns promoting blank or spoiled votes. In 2025, it was selected for the David O. Sears Best Book on Mass Politics Award by the International Society of Political Psychology. Okay, welcome, Mollie. Masaaki Higashijima, welcome back. He's an an associate professor of comparative politics at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo. He's currently affiliated with the Ellison Center for Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies, RICAS, at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, where I did my master's degree. So wonderful spot. He received his PhD in political science just up the road from Michigan State University. And he published his first book, The Dictator's Dilemma at the Ballot Box, Electoral Manipulation, Economic Maneuvering, and Political Order in Autocracies, with the Emerging Democracies Center series at University of Michigan Press, which won the Ide Jetro Award for the Studies of Developing Countries and the Ed A. Hewitt Book Prize from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So welcome to Masaaki as well. And third, Louis Schiumerini is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, where he's also a faculty fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Previously, he was a postdoctoral prize research fellow in politics at Nuffield College at Oxford. He earned his PhD in political science from Yale University. And he was a co-editor of the very first book in the Emerging Democracies series back in 2019, Campaigns and Voters in Developing Democracies, Argentina in Comparative Perspective. But his latest book, we'll be hearing about today, is Incumbency Bias with Cambridge University Press, which offers a unified theory that explains why citizens favor incumbents with an electoral advantage in some political settings, but punish them with an electoral disadvantage in other settings. So, so our three authors will be talking about their books, but also their broader set of ideas, and we'll put them in conversation from there. So really, really excited y'all could be here. I think it's gonna be an interesting kind of experimental format. So looking forward to all the presentations.
All right. Well, thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Dan, for inviting me. And it's really nice to see Mollie and Masaaki, old friends, to discuss their fantastic books. I want to thank Dan especially because both of these books have been influenced by him. Like, he is the editor of the edited volume, and it was very nice. It's not easy to publish edited volumes, and he gave us an opportunity, and we're very proud of that book. But also recently published this with Cambridge in the CP series that Dan directs. So I'm very grateful for your support. So there are many ways in which elections are against the grain, right? I think from the eye of the beholder, all elections are against the grain because many people are disappointed at what happens and they come up with rationalizations for why some elections are democratic or not. I'm going to be talking about one particular angle in which the elections could be against the grain, which is what I'm going to call incumbency-oriented voting, right? The idea that voters over-focus on who is incumbent when they cast a ballot, right? And this idea seems like perhaps controversial or not, but I mean, what I would like to emphasize is that many models of electoral accountability, and was alluding to accountability before, actually praise the fact that voters over-focus on accountability. Right? Theories of accountability say that voters should retrospectively vote, focus on the performance of the incumbent, decide whether that was good or bad, and on the basis of that, select good leaders. But if we think about it deeply, that seems like a potentially problematic rule in that it relies on asymmetric information, right? Voters, by just focusing on one particular candidate and ignoring the others, could actually perhaps not use all that they know to select good candidates. So the first book and the second book both talk about this issue. Why is incumbency salient in elections, which I'm going to call, this is like the emergence of incumbency bias. So when voters over-focus on incumbents, when they cast a ballot, incumbency bias emerges, right? But the second question of incumbency bias, which is the focus of my solo book, is on the direction of incumbency bias. Why is it that in some countries this bias favors incumbents and in some countries favors the opposition? And what we'll be talking out there is the systematic incumbency bias. Like, why are countries just trapped? Like in the US, why are Congress people systematically winning, right? This advantage is not only a one-off, it happens all the time. And the same happens in the opposite direction in other countries. So in my talk today, I will first talk about the emergence of incumbency bias, and we'll be talking quite a bit about the Michigan book with my co-authors Noam Lupu and Virginia Oliveros, and a bit about my book. And then the second part of the talk, I will be talking about my own book and the direction of incumbency bias. I hope to have some time to say about something about what's happening right now across the world against elections against the grain, in the sense that incumbents are losing so often. But if not, we can talk about that in Q&A. So this is the table of contents of the edited volume. I just want to emphasize three things about this book. This book was a book that started off with an original panel election study that we did of the Argentine national elections in 2015, where we copied the Michigan ANES study that is kind of a public good, where scholars from different places with different agendas place questions to make a public good. And we actually have 2 rounds. And on the basis of that really cool data placed by different scholars, we decided to bring them together, or some of them, into an edited volume to study different aspects of the Argentine election. So in one sense, this book is really a contribution to political science, in that we brought people such as Andy Baker and Dalton Orr, Ken Green, Rebecca Wade Shapiro, Virginia Oliveros, Liz Eichmeister, to write really important theoretically and empirically sophisticated contributions to political science on things such as strategic voting, which is something that Matt and Rebecca do in their piece, or Andy Baker, who's a specialist on political parties and bounded partisanship, who conducted a comparative study of bounded partisanship using our data, but data from our panel studies. Ken Green's piece is really a fantastic piece on campaign effects, comparing Argentina with Mexico. So in one sense, that's what this book is. It's an empirically sophisticated and theoretical contribution to political science, but in a second sense, it's a book about incumbency bias, and in particular incumbency salience. Why? So what we did was to try to examine an argument that I should have said we put together in the first chapter, Noam Lupu, Virginia Oliveros, and me, where we kind of theorize that in elections in countries where programmatic information is very limited, that is, voters cannot compare candidates on their policy preferences or any kind of other dimension that allows them to anticipate who is going to align government with their preferences, voters vote on performance, things that are much more based on the particular election. And this was a hard case for this idea. Why? Because Argentina experienced a right turn in 2015. It's the first time that an explicitly right-wing candidate won a popular election. In the past, right-wing governments were military governments. They didn't win at the ballot box because they were facing a popular party, the Peronist Party, that amassed a systematic majority over time. So in this case, that The Economist was very happy about, unsurprisingly, praising it as the victory of a right-wing candidate, we argue, even in this case, this very unlikely case, we find that performance drove vote choice. And a lot of the chapters in the book show this. So in the third chapter of the book, we were lucky that Vicky Murillo and Steve Levitsky wrote a piece kind of introducing the book and analyzing the election, and they write, Macri's victory in Argentina was in many senses historic. Macri's victory suggested the Latin American so-called left turn was coming to an end. There was a right turn coming, right? This chapter suggests that though Macri's surprising victory may be part of a broader regional trend, it's better understood as an anti-incumbent turn. In Argentina, as in much in the rest of Latin America, more than a decade of extraordinary growth rates fueled by soaring commodity prices allowed governments to build and sustain broad public support bases. Instead, ahora a decade beginning in 2000, presidents of their parties were re-elected throughout the regions. Indeed. However, two factors eventually conspire: the end of the boom and slow growth. So they're saying, yes, there was a right-wing government party winning. However, it was all out performance. And this idea is confirmed through a bunch of things that we have in the book, like a content analysis of the debate shows the debate was, words are in Spanish, right? But these are all valence things that are not at all ideological or programmatic. Change, Argentines, I want change, country, together, politics, names of candidates. When there is a leftist party that is incumbent losing against a right-wing party, the campaign is all about performance. In my own chapter, I tried to really look closely at what the mandate was. And I confirmed that the mandate was a performance mandate, right? So this shows the probability of voting for each of the main third parties. Macri is a right-wing candidate that won, right? Scioli is the leftist that lost, and this guy was kind of a mix, right? What you see in this plot is a strong correlation between performance evaluations of voters and the probability of voting. The worse the performance of the incumbents that was perceived by voters, the higher the probability of voting for Macri and Massa. The converse is true for the incumbent party Scioli. And the different lines show different measures of ideological preferences, measured by left-right placements and measured by economic issue positions. As you can see, performance overwhelmingly explains vote choice in a seemingly ideologically polarized electoral contest. Even in that context, voters really gravitated to performance. In fact, this figure from the chapter I wrote shows the preferences that voters from the different parties had in a bunch of economic issues, salient issues that would plausibly divide. And what we can see is that overwhelmingly voters agreed on things. They agreed on things such as income redistribution. Voters for the three candidates were over 70% supportive of income redistribution. Similar for differences between the rich and poor at large, which is a perception, state ownership of key industries, state management of public utilities, conditional cash transfers. These voters were actually to the left. Even voters voting for a right-wing candidate on economic issues, they were kind of, you would say, populist voters. So this was a very depolarized right turn, which suggests, consistent with the argument that we make in the book, that in environments where programmatic polarization is low, voters gravitate to performance considerations. And that's why incumbency is so salient, because performance is an attribute of the incumbent, and therefore leads to incumbency-oriented voting. Now, changing focus, this is a survey experiment from my own book, right? Where in my book, I study, I'm going to say more about what it is, but I study local elections and some national elections. And I ran a survey experiment where I randomly assigned voters in 2 Brazilian state capitals to different performance information on incumbents. And what this plot shows is that incumbents who offer public goods, that is, they have a good performance, are much more likely to be supported than a scenario where where voters are assigned to a control. However, if voters are assigned to party labels, that disappears, which again is consistent with the idea that when there is polarization on other issues that are more programmatic, such as party labels, voters pay less attention to performance. Again, suggesting that programmatic polarization is a key conditioning factor that drives the degree to which voters are incumbency-oriented in their voting. So, more broadly, the second question that I'm going to talk about today is the variation in incumbency bias. What this figure shows is that across the world, there is a huge variation in the degree to which being an incumbent is a blessing or a curse. Positive bars are countries where there is a significant difference in favor of the incumbent in probability of victory. Like we know that in the US Congress, like roughly like 40% incumbency advantage in terms of probability of victory. But many countries have that. Argentine governors, but also US State Assembly people, mayors in Indonesia, Brazilian governors. Now, quite surprisingly, in our countries, being an incumbent is a curse. The sole fact of sitting in the office makes you less likely to win an election. Brazil and India are two well-known cases of this. So my book tries to explain this variation, right? And just briefly, most of the explanations that we have focus on failed accountability in the developing world. The idea that because bad governance is so frequent, that is, incumbents are corrupt, their voters just oust them from office, therefore we have a disadvantage. Or clientelism is so widespread. Incumbents use office to just buy off voters and therefore build a systematic advantage. It's mostly about bad governance, which places countries either in a disadvantage equilibrium or advantage equilibrium. Now, my book starts from the motivation that this is a strong assumption, that in fact is not in line with reality. Most of what we know about voting in developing democracies is that voters respond to performance. They are not driven by bad governance, but by good governance when they vote. So we should have a theory of incumbency bias that starts there. And secondly, we should have a theory of incumbency bias that can integrate the variation of incumbency advantage to disadvantage, that can explain this variation. These are idiosyncratic explanations that focus on country-specific idiosyncrasies. And in fact, some countries have both things, like Brazil, for example, known for corruption as well as clientelism. Why is it that we have a disadvantage? The opposite could be throughout Argentina, where we have an advantage, but we also have a lot of corruption. So I start from a similar idea than the other book. In fact, my book ended up being influenced by the other book, but started earlier as a dissertation. So there was a whole process of thinking and rethinking, is that in low information environments where programmatic polarization is weak, voters vote on performance. So that's the same starting point. Incumbency is salient. But then the second step, and that's the novelty of this book, is why does it become an advantage in some settings and a disadvantage in others? And my argument there is that institutions create often a mismatch between the expectations that voters have of incumbents and the capacity that incumbents have to deliver, right? The expectations that voters have to do with the responsibilities or the policy scope of offices, right? Some offices have more scope, voters have higher expectations. But the capacity that incumbents have is different also, right? Because of fiscal rules that give them more discretion and more resources. So what I anticipate is that incumbency bias will be a function of the alignment between expectations and incumbent capacity. And in particular, my predictions in the book are that we are going to observe incumbency advantage in places where capacity outpaces citizen expectations, and disadvantage where the opposite is true, right? So at the core, this is what the book explores, right? How do I do this? I find country office pairs that have variations on this dimension, right? So that on average, in equilibrium, we should observe that these countries have a systematic trajectory of advantage or disadvantage. Like Brazil, we know mayors have a disadvantage, and in fact, it's a place where there are good reasons to think that expectations are much higher than capacity. But then what I do is I leverage variation within these cases across subnational offices where capacity changes to see where that leads to changes in incumbency bias. Lots of details out the data. I conducted fieldwork and I exploit natural experiments in these places as well as fiscal data. I'm going to just very briefly mention, like, if we look at data from LAPOP, in Brazil, citizens find that the mayor, at least over 60% of citizens, mayor is the main person that affects their welfare, the city's welfare. That's quite remarkable for a federal system. So expectations in Brazil are high, but people are very disappointed. Brazil is at the top of negative evaluations of mayoral performance. And why is that? Because of very low capacity. My fieldwork, which actually defined my expectations in my prospectus, I had to rewrite it, consistently found in politicians telling me it's really difficult to govern municipalities in Brazil. The fiscal pact just gives us a ton of authority and no resources. So that really helped me think through a theory. and led to the hypothesis that I presented. So just briefly, I wanted to show you one finding that I have to show how incumbent capacity shapes incumbency bias. I exploit in Brazil a law, the adoption of a law called Fiscal Responsibility Law. LRF is because of the acronym in Portuguese, Lei de Responsabilidade Fiscal, was adopted in 2000 and it bound after, right? So what I evaluate is the change in incumbency bias before and after in places where the law was binding, because what the law did was forbid fiscal deficits. So in some municipalities that were running deficits, the law meant a shock to capacity. In municipalities without deficits, the law didn't bind. So what you can see there is that what I call treated municipalities, the lighter ones, experience a shock to incumbency bias that is negative. Incumbency disadvantage, in fact, appears there. It becomes a 14 percentage point incumbency disadvantage. That is, being a mayor makes you 14 percentage points less likely to be the winner of the election than being a challenger. Whereas in places where the shock didn't bind, there is no increase, right? So it's consistent with the idea that shocks to fiscal capacity increase incumbency disadvantage. Just for a last piece of evidence on this, my argument is that what voters evaluate is performance in terms of good governance. What voters are looking for is things that benefit the community as a whole. Economic growth at the national level, which is what we kind of saw in the book about the Argentine presidential election. Public goods provision at the local level, which is what goes on at the local level in Brazil. This figure shows the correlation between changes in public goods spending in Brazilian municipalities and incumbency bias, where public goods spending means education, health, and transportation. What you see here is that the change in public goods spending in Brazil is strongly correlated with the net incumbency bias of municipalities, so much so that high performers have advantage. The average is kind of a disadvantage, consistent with what we know overall. That's why we have more data actually on a disadvantage, but actually we have variation in Brazilian incumbency bias consistent with voters evaluating incumbents for their public goods provision. So this is a story about good governance being evaluated by citizens, which seems like what accountability sounds like, but in a setting in which incumbents are heavily constrained. So if voters cannot observe those constraints, we have an outcome that is consistent with incumbency bias, but not because democracy is hopeless, but because democracy often operates in low information environments. So how am I doing with time? I have a bit more. Okay, so just briefly to conclude on one thing that I've been thinking about and that people ask me is, so why are incumbents losing worldwide, right? I started talking about incumbency disadvantage here. Many people were, but it was about some national elections, and the consensus was that at the national level, this was not true. In fact, typically it isn't, right? In the US, presidents overwhelmingly tend to win elections, incumbents, with the last two exceptions. But the same is true in Argentina, which historically all presidents got reelected with the exception of the two elections. And you see this in many countries. You see it in Brazil. There is a global trend of incumbents losing. So I have two conjectures about this. That I won't claim that my book answers this question. I have no evidence on this in the book. But I think there are two ideas that are implied by it that could be helpful. So the first one is that, in principle, you may think that the high levels of polarization that we are observing across the world, if our argument is true, should reduce incumbency bias, right? Because if voters are voting on polarized issues, they care less about who is the incumbent. So on average, it shouldn't be a curse or a blessing. Now, what's going on these days is that polarization is not so much programmatic as it is affective. And I think this is a hunch I have that I honestly want to do research on and I haven't been started, is that affective polarization has a tendency to carry a negative incumbency bias. I think there is something about affective polarization that makes it harder for the incumbent to win than for the challenger to win. I think there are two mechanisms for this. One is that, on the one hand, voters care about performance in these settings, but on the other hand, the way in which they evaluate it has a tendency to be biased against incumbents. A lot of the evaluations that come after affect is so salient are influenced by fake news, by negativity biases, and this, I think, is kind of a perverse scenario in which voters care about performance, but in a way that their evaluations are tend to disfavor the income. And secondly, I think there is a negativity bias in terms that negative sentiments, such as the one that affective polarization encourages, makes it easier for negative sentiments to coalesce than for positive ones. Just one thing about Argentina. Our survey, the one in the book that I talked about, has an affective polarization measure, which is unusual. For example, LAPOC doesn't have that. And then we redid the survey twice in a row, so now we have over a decade of affective polarization. The affective polarization in 2015 Argentina had in that election is one of the lowest ever recorded. Look at what happened after. This is the highest level of affective polarization that has been measured. So I think that there is something out of affective polarization that kicks in and makes it harder for incumbents to be reelected, and we can joke about it. I think that's for a different day. But secondly, I want to close with this. I think that incumbents are losing because there is a decline in incumbent capacity worldwide. I think it's increasingly hard for incumbents to govern well. And things that were very much present in the last election in the US, I think are part of a global phenomenon. The affordability crisis is making it harder for policymakers to have the tools that really affect the outcomes that voters care about. And I also think that a lot of the kind of interests that get mobilized in elections having to do with the new economy are also harder for traditional economic tools to influence. We have voters that are not captured by traditional coalitions. They are getting lost. So I think it's increasingly hard for incumbents. In the past, presidents always had tools to kind of eventually push up their popularity. I think that has run out. So these are just two ideas that I was thinking about out of how elections are against the grain in a timely sense, not in the more like perennial sense of incumbency bias. But I'd be curious to hear what others think about this. And with this, I close. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dan, for this invitation. This is such an exciting event for me. Okay, so I'm Mollie Cohen. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about my book, None of the Above. So this book focuses on a type of voter that political scientists tend to ignore. So when we in political science talk about elections, we're usually hyper-focused on who won, who lost, and why. Sometimes when we're trying to answer that question, we focus on who turned out and who abstained. We think that sort of the members of the electorate will shift outcomes. This book focuses on a different group of electorally relevant citizens who political scientists have largely ignored. These folks pay all of the costs of voting in elections. They register to vote, they travel to the polls on election day, they wait in long lines, just like you and me. But then when they get to the ballot box, instead of casting an affirmative vote for a candidate, they leave the ballot blank or they spoil it. They cast what we call invalid votes. So rates of invalid voting are in Latin America are the highest in the world. So we frequently see in mayoral elections, gubernatorial elections, levels of over 20 or 30%. The null vote will beat winning candidates in those contests. And in fact, in presidential elections, the average since the 1980s democratic transitions is over 6% with huge variation. So we'll see things like 19.5% in Bolivia just about 6 weeks ago. So very high rates of invalid voting. So you might still be wondering, like, what is an invalid vote? Most American audiences do. So it's picture time. That's the best part of this book. Okay, so what is an invalid ballot? It's a vote for which no clear preference can be identified. So generally speaking, there are three ideal types of invalid ballot. The first is what we call blank votes. This is an example from the Argentine gubernatorial elections in 2015. Don't squint at it looking for marks. There are none on it except for this little stamp on the side that says anulado, nullified, doesn't count. Blank votes are very easy to identify. There's not a lot of discretion involved in determining whether a vote is blank or not. It's just empty or it's not. Okay, one ideal type. The second ideal type is what we call a null ballot. This is a ballot that has been destroyed or mismarked in a way that a voter's preference cannot be identified. So here we have an example from the Chilean presidential elections in 2005. To correctly mark this ballot, this voter should have placed a single vertical mark across the single horizontal mark next to the candidate of their preference. But you can see that this ballot has 4 affirmative choices selected. As a result, it's impossible to identify who this voter actually wanted. You might sort of conjecture, well, the thickest one is at the bottom, so probably that one. I think people have said to me every time I present this figure. But because it's unclear what their preference is, this ballot is deemed null. Okay, so those are the 2 sort of overarching types. Within that second category of null votes, we have the fun invalid ballots. These are the spoiled votes. These carry messages. For example, this ballot from the second round presidential election in El Salvador in 2014 says mejoren la oferta electoral. It has big X between both candidates. Improve the electoral options. So when I talk about invalid votes, I am talking about the blanks plus the nulls, and those nulls include accidentally mismarked ballots and also intentionally spoiled ballots. Okay, so this book sort of answers 2 different puzzles. So the first puzzle is sort of trying to unpack why exactly people go to all this effort and then invalidate their ballots at the polls. It seems kind of nuts, and theories of political science don't do a good job, I think, of explaining why people would go to all this effort. So the book shows, I'm not going to show you a ton of evidence today. I'm going to try really hard to keep it short. It's hard, y'all. So most votes I show in Latin American presidential elections are cast on purpose. It is not the case that this is a predominantly accidental behavior. And frankly, individuals who intentionally spoil their votes look a lot like other habitual voters. They're more educated. They are wealthier on average. They participate actively in their communities. These are, when you look at them, sort of from a socio-demographic standpoint, you say like, oh, that's a voter, right? The thing that distinguishes these folks is they're really angry. And they're angry at specific candidates, or they're angry about specific policy outcomes. So the second puzzle that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on today is this. So how do campaigns promoting invalid voting shape this behavior? Okay, so I already did story time 1 with pictures, but you might be wondering what campaigns promoting invalid voting? This sounds nuts. It's not, it happens all the time. So here's just a casual example. So in Ecuador in 2021, there was a presidential election. In the first round, losing candidate, Yaku Perez, he came in 3rd place. He was the first indigenous candidate who was predicted to succeed to go to a runoff in Ecuador, excuse me. So in that election, he was nudged out of the runoff election by 32,115 votes. So less than a third of a percentage point, about a third of a percentage point. So he lodged formal complaints with the Electoral Commission. A formal recount was started and stopped and started again, stopped again. There was a cross-national protest march. After all of this, Perez said to his supporters, you know what, this is broken. I'm going to choose la tercera vía. I'm going to take the 3rd way. I'm not going to vote for either of these available candidates. I'm going to spoil my vote, and I invite you to as well. So on election day on social media, images like this started to abound. So up top here, we have, these are some of my favorite null ballots. So we're just going to do this. Este voto no lo podrán votar, robar. They won't be able to rob this vote, sort of referencing those claims of electoral fraud. In the middle, this is Yaku Perez himself casting his spoiled vote. It says Yaku Presidente Resistencia, Yaku for President, Resistance. My favorite null vote of all time is in the bottom. The Spanish speakers are laughing. It is most politely translated as the candidates are not worth shit. There are ruder translations. I won't say them.
Yeah,
that's enough. So these images were everywhere. In fact, the spoiled vote rate surged. So in 2021, in the first round, where null vote rates are usually higher than in runoffs, about 12.1% of all votes were spoiled. In the runoff, over 17% of ballots were spoiled in Ecuador. And that is more than 3 times the usual rate of invalid voting in runoffs in Ecuador. Okay, so one thing that this book does, it's like very academic and very important, is that it defines the null vote campaign and actually goes out and seeks to find evidence of their existence and then tries to assess whether they're successful or not, and under what conditions they succeed or fail. So prior to this book, we sort of identified these campaigns on an ad hoc basis, usually after images like this flooded our airwaves. So the definition is that an invalid vote campaign is coordinated activity that promotes blank or spoiled voting with the intent to persuade individuals to cast invalid votes in a given constituency. Two key pieces, they're in blue, coordinated people. So one person standing in the town square waving a sign, that's not a campaign. That's just a person shouting at a crowd. And if there's no intent to persuade, but merely reporting on, that doesn't constitute a campaign. Okay, so little bit of evidence, very little bit. I sort of create a new data set of invalid vote campaigns in all presidential elections in Latin America from 1980 or democratic transitions to 2020. This figure shows the share of election rounds that included a null vote campaign by decade. You can see that they increased from less than 10% in the 1980s to about a third of all election rounds in the 2010s. This has not decreased since the book was published. In fact, if anything, it seems like it's going up. So these campaigns are quite common. Puzzlingly, they're extremely unpopular. So this figure shows, this is data from a representative sample of Peruvians. These data were collected by the Americas Barometer in 2017. They were just asked, how firmly do you approve or disapprove of individuals or groups trying to convince others to leave the ballot blank or spoil it? You can see here that by far the most common response is strongest disapproval. It's the modal category. Almost 40% of respondents gave that answer. In fact, I think it's less than 15% approve of invalid vote campaigns in the abstract. So one thing this book does, and I'm not going to walk through the evidence right now, but I think it's pretty cool, is it looks at the circumstances in which voters change their opinions about null vote campaigns, under what circumstances people come to approve or accept these campaigns. So for today, I have 3 major takeaways from the book that I'd like to share with you. And then I'm going to tell you like 3 things about other work I'm working on, and then I'm off. 15 minutes. Okay, so first, campaigns are more likely to emerge after democratic decline. So these are in large part a response to democratic backsliding, particularly in the area of elections. So when elites, incumbent presidents, undermine the quality of elections, make them less free, less fair, tilt the field, you're more likely to see a null vote campaign emerge. When campaigns protest anti-democracy actions by incumbents, they are more likely to succeed. That is, the null vote rate is more likely to increase compared to what we would otherwise expect. So that means if it seems like the campaign promoters are just sharing beef, like, I don't like this guy, they don't succeed. When they do succeed is when the incumbent has systematically gone after voting rights, has excluded opposition candidates. Campaigns in those circumstances are far more likely to succeed. Voters are not fools. It's an important thing. And finally, authoritarian candidates do not usually benefit from invalid vote campaigns. So when Evo Morales came out this summer, 3 weeks before the election, and started calling for voters in Bolivia to spoil their votes, he doesn't appear to have benefited from that campaign. It's unlikely he will benefit from that campaign. In fact, the only authoritarian candidate to date who has identified from a campaign like this is Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. So not a great guy. He benefited an awful lot from the null vote campaign, but he's one example of many dozens of examples that have failed. Okay. My favorite part about this book is that it's full of good news. It's actually not really a story about elections against the grain. It's a story about how angry people use the ballot box in a way that is creative and unusual to express their feelings about politics while also expressing their buy-in to the political system. I find these people hilarious and really inspiring, right? Nothing brings me quite as much joy as seeking out null ballots online. They're hilarious. And that's important because all of my other work is depressing. So generally I come bearing bad news. So I was thinking about, well, I study elections. Dan said, talk a little bit more about your other work. Okay, it's all bad news. So I look at how election administration sort of shapes citizen confidence in elections and election outcomes themselves. It's bad news. So poll watchers, for example, really polarize people's elections, sort of perceptions of elections. Another sort of set of projects that I work on looks at how candidates with authoritarian proclivities shape public attitudes about democracy. Winning elections, if you're supportive of an authoritarian candidate, sort of like a Bolsonaro in Brazil, that improves voter support for democracy. That seems like probably a good thing. That improvement is like real conditional. It's very brittle and actually is not as good news as we might hope. So I'm happy to talk about those things later. I'd prefer not to. I'd prefer we focus on this. Good news is hard to get these days. Anyways, thank you all so much for your attention.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you so much, Dan, for the very kind introduction and invitation. And I'm feeling a little bit nervous because my family is sitting there. So, but yeah, let me start. Yeah, I completed most of this book manuscript while I was at the University of Michigan during in 2018 to 2020. So without support from University of Michigan, I could not have completed this book. So I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to talk about the what I did, I argued in this book, but also I'm going to introduce some recent works by me and my wonderful collaborators. So main takeaways of my brief talk is that threefold. So the first one is that political leaders, even in autocratic regimes, are often reluctant to rely much on blatant fraud, like stuffing the ballot box or intimidating voters and using election violence before elections to manipulate elections. The second is that this, however, does not necessarily mean that leaders always desire a free game in elections. And this means that leaders employ various methods which are less visible and also less risky to manufacture election results favorable to them. So let me explain these 3 points. So first of all, blatant electoral fraud is costly and also very risky. It's costly because in order to implement systematic blatant fraud, it needs a strong cooperation from ruling elites, various ruling elites, like local elites in electoral districts and also those in the central government and bureaucrats to administer elections. So if dictators or political leaders cannot systematically mobilize those ruling elites, the blatant electoral fraud serves as a really weak signal of dictators' strength. And secondly, blatant electoral fraud may undermine various informational benefits derived from elections. So if, for example, political leaders hold elections which are relatively free and fair, then the research suggests that dictators can glean some information from election results. And also by holding less manipulated elections, but if dictators could win elections overwhelmingly, then the dictators can demonstrate that they are very popular. So it means that if electoral fraud is employed, then those benefits are significantly undermined. And it's also risky because various research, both experimental and observational survey data analysis, suggests that it significantly damage regime legitimacy. So people think that after being exposed to fraud, they lower perceived fairness of elections, for example. And at the extreme, such elections could spark outsiders' protests. And also, even if dictators use system fraud but fail to win big, then it also signals weakness of dictators, which leads to coup d'etat or some other rebellions within the regime. So blatant fraud is costly and risky, but on the other hand, if political leaders employ hold fraud-free elections, then the good side is that risk and cost of blatant fraud can be minimized and mitigated, but the certainty of winning big is also reduced under such elections. So, which I call electoral dilemma in dictatorships in my book. And the main purpose of my book is to think about how dictators take balance between credibility of election results and certainty of winning big. So this means that political leaders need to strategically decide how to tilt the electoral field. So so the question here is, how do political leaders gain benefits of less manipulated elections, but still win those elections? And I suggest that there are broadly three methods to deal with this electoral dilemma. And the first primarily tool that I focused on in my book is economic distribution or economic maneuvering before elections, as I told in the book. So this simply means that dictators time the distribution of pork and club goods or public goods before elections. So my book empirically and theoretically showed that autocrats who have abundant natural resources tend to reduce blatant forms of electoral fraud, like election violence or march for voting or stuffing the ballot box, while boosting election year fiscal spending. And in the book, I conducted comparative case studies of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And in Kyrgyzstan, President Nazarbayev increased the level of fiscal spending as the country enjoyed rich natural resources, and then he reduced the level of electoral fraud over time. But in Kyrgyzstan, the President Akayev couldn't do that, so the elections backfired against him. So by exchanging votes with club goods, leaders can win elections without relying much on risky fraud. But so some dictators have rich financial resources to distribute, but many others do not necessarily have such financial resources. So what about leaders who lack fiscal resources, which is my next question. And the second method to manipulate elections in implicit way is what I call the subtle forms of manipulation in a paper, which is less visible techniques for biasing election results compared to blatant forms of electoral fraud. And specifically, I refer to pre-electoral legal restrictions producing pro-regime election results. So for example, in Russia and Central Asia, governments often deregister opposition candidates from various reasons, like sexual or fiscal scandals, or they say that opposition candidates are unprepared for making correct documentations to run for elections or something, which is not very visible among for most citizens. Or they may pack election management institutions by feeding members from ruling coalitions to bias election results. or they may they may introduce some biased media access while excluding opposition candidates and parties to get access to media. And also by using limited media access, the authoritarian government often embark on soft propaganda, which enable autocrats to gather public support without distributing goodies. And also another interesting method of manipulating electoral field is, so some electoral law stipulates that government has some discretion of manipulating election timing, especially among parliamentary democracies. So, for example, in Japan, the prime ministers often call early elections, which this much research suggests that such early elections produce very pro-incumbent biases toward the LDP. So, so these are, this election timing manipulation is also embedded in the, specific components in electoral law. So this is also kind of subtle forms of electoral manipulation. And importantly, those subtle types of manipulation can be recognized by only citizens who are, very savvy, familiar with, and also interested in elections and politics. So, so if political leaders employ those forms of electoral manipulation, it is quite difficult for many citizens to recognize those manipulation techniques. So this is a kind of part of results from my papers. So here we investigated the relationship between blatant fraud, subtle forms of electoral manipulation, and perceived fairness of elections using survey data, observational survey data from 67 countries. And so here, this is EMB control, and this is a limits on media access. And the y-axis represents perceived fairness of elections among citizens. And you can see, even if, for example, the government controls EMBs and deprives EMB autonomy, both incumbent supporters and non-incumbent supporters do not change their perception of election fairness in significant ways. And the same holds true for media access. But on the other hand, voter intimidation and aggregation fraud, which are typical ways of blatant fraud, this significantly drops the citizens' perception of electoral fairness. So these results suggest that subtle forms of electoral manipulation may be less visible, but still the government can enjoy some biases through elections. And the right figure shows the relationship between election timing manipulation, blatant fraud, and trust in government and parliament. And here, this is the results for blatant fraud. And soon after elections, also it's not statistically significant, but soon after elections, the coefficient is negative. And this negative coefficient stays longer over time. And the same true for trust in parliament. It's a little bit negative in statistically significant, but either way, the blatant electoral fraud is risky for political leaders. But for election timing manipulation, so soon after an election was held, the coefficient is almost zero for trust in government and also trust in parliament. And then it tends to go up, meaning that after, as time goes by, the citizens begin to feel that the government and parliament are more trustable. This means that the election timing is less recognizable, and also by manipulating election timing, the government can keep stable majorities through elections. So over time, they can make efficient policy making. So the trust in government and parliament tends to increase. So this means election timing manipulation may be less visible, but still advantageous to the government, the ruling parties. And this third one is manipulation of electoral systems. And here I mean the manipulation of electoral systems as manipulating electoral rules, which translate vote shares to seat shares. And for example, we can think about electoral system reforms, like single-member district systems from SMD to proportional representation systems, or especially under SMD systems, the government can engage in gerrymandering in serious ways. And also Trump tried to gerrymander in the Texas state recently. And there are many other examples of gerrymandering, of course. And also malapportionment, the gap between gap of value of votes across regions would be also one technique of manipulation of electoral systems. And importantly, similar to subtle forms of electoral manipulation, understanding electoral rules and every detail of electoral rules would be highly technical for citizens. So these manipulations may build in pro-incumbent seat bias without being recognized by citizens. And here I took some graph from my book, and this is a data analysis from electoral authoritarian regimes across national data. And you can see that in majoritarian systems, because in autocratic regimes, the ruling party is only big party. So SMD systems produces a significant seat bias only to the ruling party. So this is a seat bias, and this seat shares, it tends to be biased toward 100% relative to vote shares. And here for opposition parties, the seat shares tend to be biased towards 0%, while this is a distribution of vote shares. And the under proportional representation systems, those two lines tend to be overlapped more. And also for malapportionment in OECD democracies, there is relatively lower levels of malapportionment. But both non-OECD democracies and autocracies, there are many countries which suffer the higher levels of malapportionment. So which may suggest the government even in non-OECD democracies, but also in autocracies, tend to employ higher levels of malapportionment or keep them to bias election results. So concluding remarks, my research book and also several recent papers suggest that elections without overt fraud may not be necessarily signs for democratic openness. So and also it does not pave the way for democratic transitions and also democratic consolidation. So maybe we need to keep that fact in mind to further think about the role of elections in democracies. And this is because incumbents can embed several hidden mechanisms that significantly bias results without sparking backlash or the backlash. So, and also I like to say that, so my book was about autocratic regimes, but such tactics appear not only in autocracies, but also in democracies, especially experiencing democratic backsliding. So of course, some authoritarian leaders in emerging democracies use a blatant way of manipulation and violence, but at the same time, they try to manipulate elections in implicit ways. So it may be very important for to think more about how political leaders bias election results and also undermine democratic principles in these hidden ways. Thank you so much.
Deeper set of problems here, right? Which is that even when elections are free, fair, and competitive, it doesn't necessarily produce a democratic electoral connection at all, even in the electoral exercise itself. So for Masaaki, because these economic manipulations and hidden mechanisms that can be used. Again, so the elections could be totally fine, but doesn't produce what we'd expect. In Mollie's examples, I mean, you don't necessarily have popular candidates. I mean, we somehow assume that somehow the universe is going to generate popular candidates for us to vote for. But again, it doesn't necessarily. And so just the fact there's a competition among people who maybe have no democratic credentials or popularity at all is a real possibility. And then I think for Luis, I think we're in a world now where there's just categorical judgment errors. It's the equivalent of kicking the dog because you're frustrated with your boss. You kind of some of this voting going on is you sort of think that politicians have the capacity, that governors, mayors, they have the capacity to make these things work, but they really don't. So these elections just don't give any kind of, so there's this real kind of disconnection between what we think elections can do and democratic outcomes. So to me, they kind of spoke together in a really interesting way. But I want to make sure we have time to open up to the folks here and give you a chance to respond to each other as well. So anybody want to take a first? So trying to give everyone a little time to formulate there. So hopefully you're all ignoring my comment while you're thinking about your own question. Any first shot? Adam? Thanks.
This question's for Professor Schiumerini and okay, it's for Luis. And when you were relaying the theory of incumbency bias at the subnational level, that all seemed very plausible about the expectations on capacity and delivery. And then when you got to the conjecture about effective polarization and fake news, that seemed really plausible, not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level. And I don't know, when I hear election theories, I'll like just work down from the most populous countries. So like I was thinking about in India with subnational BJP politicians will always like say that their opponents support this quote unquote love jihad, where they're trying to convert unsuspecting Hindu women to Islam. That's fake news. And they're preying on like effective polarization between Hindu and Muslim voters. And then in the US, I thought about how like we know how nationalized local and subnational politics has become. And there's a lot of effective polarization and fake news there, of course. And there are also these issues with US subnational politics where it's like not competitive anyway. And like there aren't viable candidates that can amass enough corporate money to, so I just wondered if you had any thoughts about like, if you would write it again, if you'd write the book again, would you incorporate effective polarization and fake news into the theory at the subnational level, or is it specific because it's Latin America? So those are my questions.
Thank you. Those are great. And I mean, I can speculate and think with you because I don't have answers or things that I'm grappling with. So I think I would separate fake news from news, right? I did try to bring the informational, like media environment more. It's something that comes naturally to a question on incumbency bias because my argument is fundamentally about information. So I had expectations about ways in which the informational environment. There is a lot of work, for example, in Brazil about radios. And doing my fieldwork, I was struck by how many politicians have their own radio. Oh, do you want to come to America? And they have this kind of thing in the back of their house and they would just fork. And it's funny because now with social media, this is gone, right? But this was all the rage. I ended up not doing much with that, to be honest. But I think there is a whole set of questions about what kind of information they consume and the degree to which that, favors incumbents or not. I think that's a big question. And I think we should, but then there is a broader, the more specific aspect about fake news, and I would say like negative sentiment, which is more specific to social media. This is because there was kind of a tension between my overall argument in the book, by myself, but also with Noam and Virginia about the role of polarization. And our argument, and this is, we can come up with this, right? There is a research that says this, when there is polarization on another dimension, you pay less attention to incumbent, right? So we thought that that's what was going on there, even though there was a right-wing candidate because there was an ideological polarization, but people voted on performance. But now we're finding that in a high polarization environment, like the one we're in right now, arguably all-time high across the world, there is a lot of incumbency-oriented voting, which is kind of in tension with our prediction. So I think there is something about affective polarization specifically, and that's where fake news, I think, comes in. But there is an overall package out negative effect more broadly that I think works against incumbents. Like, to me, it was like when I was following the last US election, I was struck by how high on the one hand there was huge polarization, like all kinds of negative sentiment. You saw the debates, but on the other hand, there was a lot of talk about performance, like cost of living issues and affordability crisis. So I think that those two things were in our argument work in parallel, and they reduce the weight of each other. I think they were kind of reinforcing each other. There was something out the fake news and effectively polarized environment that made the evaluations more negative against the incumbents. There is something there. This is a hunch I have, and I'm trying to think out a way of investigating. So that's what I'm trying to do. There is something out affective polarization that negatively reinforces negative performance evaluations. Yeah, so some thoughts. We can talk more if you have ideas.
Yeah, Tam?
Yes, I don't have a question for you because I'm from Vietnam, so voting is a foreign thing. But in US politics, there's a book that I got to discuss called The Politics President Make.
Yeah.
That has a lot to do with the performance of the incumbents and with the.
That's Skoronic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good book. Yeah.
Yes. So I when you present, I presented I remember the book, and I think the takeaway would be really about the performance of that. But I do have a question for, I'm sorry, I cannot see your name from here.
Mollie.
I'm Mollie.
Mollie. My question for you is that I recently had a debate with my professor about voting behavior, and so in a way I defended the voters, but he said that when you vote on the basis of the outcome, not the leverage. So my question for you would be the behavior of those voters that you identify, the protest voters. On which basis did they vote?
So I think that when we talk about voting, we often make a series of assumptions about the way that people vote. And some of them are better founded and some are worse founded. So there's this, classical theory about the rational voter. The outcome I want is X. If I can't get X, I'm going to vote to the closest option that is viable to X, or I won't turn out. If the options available are equally distasteful to me, I just won't turn out and vote. And these sort of rational theories of voter behavior underlie a lot of our theoretical thinking. I think increasingly people are viewing voting as both sort of addictive and habit forming. So people are socialized, like the Michigan school tells us all about socialization. You learn to vote at home as a child, you turn out to vote, and you vote in a particular way based on your socialization. So my family belongs to whichever party, and that's the party that I identify with as well. It's a social identity. And so participating is not so much about the candidates on offer as it is an expression of, who I am and what I believe. This book is really sort of a third offshoot from these arguments, which is about expressive voting. So there are people for which the outcome is not the point. These are people who are invested in democracy as a system of government. They approve of democracy as a system of government. They're really mad about the way it's working. They don't like the candidates they have available to them. They're not effectively polarized in the sense that they hate everybody equally. They don't like anyone. So a thing about affective polarization that I think we often ignore in our discussions of it is it requires not only that I hate that guy, but that I tolerate this guy, or ideally I like this guy. The people who are spoiling their votes in this way, this is an expressive vote. You often hear people in Latin America talk about it's a voto de hígado. It's a rage vote. It's from the liver, is how they describe it. And it's it's an expression of sentiment, and it actually has nothing to do with the result. Campaigns will often try to convince people that if enough of us spoil our votes, we'll get a new election with new candidates. And that's true. That is how electoral rules work in most of these countries. But the bar is like an absolute or super majority of all votes, which is higher than any winning candidate wins in these elections. So it hasn't happened in a national election yet. It's happened in mayoral elections, but not in national elections. So different voters are different, I guess, is the answer that I would give to your initial question. Like, it depends. These voters, I think, on average, are not sort of following those. Yeah.
Follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think the voting system matter in this case? So like say, for example, if we shift to ranked choice. voting
If we shift
system,
to what?
the voting system, the either first past the post or PR, or would it matter to
To like the decision to
sort
spoil
of
your vote?
nudge?
So
Really
yes, so we do tend to see lower rates of invalid voting in more proportional systems because people who like minority parties get better. Rates are higher in mandatory vote systems, but if you look at the reasons that people spoil their votes, they look very similar across system types. It is not the case that in mandatory vote systems, so like in Peru, for example, in Argentina, if you don't vote, you pay a fine. And sometimes there are also bureaucratic costs. So like you can't get a passport, you can't go to the bank and take money out until you pay the fine. So it's very costly not to vote. It is the case that null vote rates are higher in those countries, but if you actually look at the reasons that people say they spoil their vote, they're exactly the same across system types. It's not the case that it's an abstention-related behavior under compulsory voting and not under voluntary voting.
And you're arguing they're principled Democrats. That's part of the really interesting part of the book in a way, right? Is that it's a very recuperative reading of people who spoil their ballots.
Try hard.
Yeah. Well, and so do they.
So do they.
Right. Lady.
I have two questions. Thank you so much. One for Luis and one for Mollie. For Luis, how do you make sense? I study Argentina, so it's pretty insightful what you say, but how do you incorporate a political phenomena as salient as the caciques and the families who actually own politics in the provinces? I'm thinking about the Rodriguez family in San Luis, where they don't even care about incumbents because they say who's going to be there. And we both know that being a governor of San Luis is much more important than being a center of the nation. So how do you capture that within your theory to address that, like that form of cacicazgo?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something we have in Colombia also.
Yeah.
So that's one question. And then for Mollie is, how do you address this voting systems that actually capture, because you mentioned blank, null, and valid, but for example, in Colombia, we have blank. And is actually captured, and it's pretty important percentage of the total votes where voting is not mandatory. So how do you address that? And also in your perspective, I find it very interesting. And then the other thing is, how do you capture those who are voting with their guts, con el hígado, when a voter actually has to choose? There's an expression that says between poison and vomit.
Mm-hmm.
Or el veneno or el vomit. You choose, but you do go and you vote. And we Latin Americans know that sometimes we've taken poison and sometimes we've taken the other route. So how do you capture those things? I don't know, besides Colombia. And then also a side note, in Argentina, there's a technique to get away with that. And if you are 101 kilometers away from your voting poll, you can actually claim, and there's a spot in La Provincia de Buenos Aires to actually just on election day, just be there, have a party. And those are Democrats who are like 101 kilometers away, and we don't have to vote, and that they get away with, being forced to. Anyway, that's a side note. Yeah.
Sure. So the voto en blanco in Colombia is a really interesting phenomenon. It is a systematized, like formalized blank vote mechanism. In the book, I just treat it as blank votes because it's people are casting a vote that they are explicitly calling a protest vote. So I code those as protest
But
votes.
they are incorporated within the
incorporated-
percentages, and so the implications are
Right.
different.
Well, they're incorporated into the denominator, but it is not the case that those seats are left empty. So
Yeah,
it changes
The
the
distribution.
threshold, it changes the distribution,
distribution.
but it doesn't change I think the message of the
Yeah.
So the book is exclusively focused on executive elections. So a lot of the sort of complicated institutional arrangements, like is it a D'Hondt formula versus some other formula? I don't study formulas. Don't really apply here. These are first past the post contests, or they are multi-round absolute majority contests. So I look at presidential elections and gubernatorial elections. So in that sense, the institutions are simpler. And I think it's also easier to identify the protest message, because the mechanical task of voting in a presidential election is at its easiest. The information environment is at its best. It's not the case. I mean, there is plenty of fake news in presidential and gubernatorial elections, but it's far lower than in mayoral elections. And so I think that's what I'd say. And then I'll let Luis take it.
Yeah, it's 500 kilometers, by the way.
500?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, this was something else I was going to
The
say.
association is called the 500 kilometers, and they go and they
They
party
get-
500 kilometers away, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Although fines are not applied. But so the chapter on Argentina is on governors. So this is something I think about. I think the question you're asking is broadly, encapsulated within the question about subnational authoritarianism, which is a literature that has been quite influential and that has addressed this kind of, governors who get reelected. And the idea, as the concept suggests, is that these are mini authoritarianisms, right? Ed Gibson, not far away from here, popularized that idea. I argue a bit against that. So I think what my book shows is that even in those cases, a lot of what drives the re-election of these guys is that they govern well. So it's really, I try to investigate the mechanisms that this literature emphasizes, such as patronage, and that plays a much weaker role than public goods provision. So I kind of push a bit against that. I mean, Argentina is an extreme case, and there is a lot of non-democratic action. So it's a province that takes us closer to what Masaaki was talking about. Like we have, of my cases, is the one that is more favorable to less sanguine interpretations of this phenomenon, but still there is a lot of good governance being rewarded. In fact, the Rodriguez are known to be quite good governors.
They are very good.
Then they also pack the courts and go after the media, but also they govern. It's kind of a mix. And then I would say, in terms of, so dynasticism is a global phenomenon. And I think it makes sense because there is something about dynasticism that solves, the Bavarian problem of succession, right? So in the US, you see a lot. So I think Argentina is not an extreme case of dynasticism a la Brazil or the Philippines or India, where you have these families that persist. I think it's more personalism, like these political parties that are kind of very localized and they persist in power, and it's easier to, when you face term limits, transfer to some. But I don't think it's so much dynasticism as low competitiveness, although it's hard to tease those things out for sure.
Can I ask some questions?
Of course,
Yeah.
Masaaki, go ahead.
So thanks so much for sharing very interesting books. So I have some questions to Mollie and also Luis. For Mollie's book, I'm wondering, so there should be some alternative ways for opposition supporters to, to make voice against the government, right? So in addition to protest voting, they may take to the street, literally, to protest against the government. Also, they may boycott elections or they may abstain from voting. So there are multiple ways which may not be very mutually exclusive, but have you ever thought about exploring the relationships between those opposition strategies? That's my question.
Yeah.
And for Luis' book, so in my understanding, so you measured incumbent capacity from the capacity to distribute public, goods, right? And I thought that so incumbents may also have other ways to keep incumbent biases, right? Like as I talked a little bit, they may bend electoral rules or other, non-economic ways. So I'm wondering how your argument can be combined with non-economic perspectives of incumbent violence.
Masaki thinks in substitutes. You can see it. He's
Yeah.
applying these other ways too.
A lot of
Great.
it, it's all
Yeah.
trade-offs,
Yeah.
all trade-offs. Yes, which is pretty smart.
Go ahead.
No, so I mean, I think this question relates to the prior question, right? And I think you also reminded me of something that I could have responded to, as well, which perhaps is insightful. So, I mean, it's very difficult to sometimes tease these mechanisms out. I try to kind of evaluate the relative role of mechanisms that are more seemingly authoritarian, for lack of a better word, just use that as a placeholder, and more like good governance, such as patronage, public employment, and they're much weaker predictors of incumbents. So that's one thing I do. The other thing I look at, and then, but just more broadly as a scope condition, these are kind of democratic cases. Like in Brazil, at the subnational level, there are no undemocratic tools that they don't have any discretion. I mean, so there is, in Argentina, there is a bit more, especially governors like the Rodriguez Sass. So one tool that really stands out in this literature is modifying re-election rules, essentially eliminating term limits, and people like in San Luis and other countries have indefinite re-election. So there are 2 or 3 provinces that have had the same governor for like 30 or 40 years, like Formosa is a well-known one. And I investigated the degree to which shifting re-election rules, and in particular adopting indefinite re-election, increases incumbency bias, and I found no effect of it. But this is not because it doesn't matter. This is because this is done on top of other things. By the time they got there, it's already consolidated. But for the most part, I don't find that these mechanisms are the ones that ultimately do. But it's all, I mean, this is a problem in the literature on distributive politics. In their book, Dunning and Stokes talk about this extensively. There are all kinds of selection issues because these things are used strategically. So when you measure them, maybe you won't find. So I am aware of the caveats, but to the best of my ability, I don't find a strong correlation between these tools and more benevolent good governance.
I'm so glad you asked this question about substitutes. So I spent a long time, I don't spend a lot of space in the book, sort of dealing with this question. So people tend to often view sort of protest voting as a substitute or complement to other behaviors. So it's a substitute for abstention, particularly where voting is mandatory. That's like a very common view. Or it is another form of protest among people who are already anarchists and like throw bombs in the streets. And so I find no evidence of either of those things. If you sort of look at the demographic and attitudinal profiles of people who say that they spoiled their vote versus people who report protesting, there's very little overlap in those categories. Less than 2% of people in nationally representative post-election surveys from 21 country years, I want to say, in the Americas, less than 2% of those folks both spoiled a ballot and participated in a street protest. They are just different categories of people. It doesn't mean that these people will never protest in the street, and it doesn't mean that these people will never spoil their vote. It's just that on average, those aren't the same people. And when you also look at sort of the profile, the attitudinal profile, the educational profile, the demographic profile of folks who abstain versus folks who spoil their ballots, they just look different. Like on average, not everyone, but on average, the people who report spoiling their ballots are more educated, wealthier. They participate in their communities, like community meetings. They're politically engaged individuals. They look like voters, like in every way. They're not distinguishable from other voters. They look very different from abstainers. And so it's kind of it's not what you would expect, sort of based on received wisdom we have about who does this. Like the common knowledge, the common wisdom is like, this is just people making mistakes. There's some of that. This is all fraud. It doesn't appear to all be fraud. Or this is just people who don't want to vote, who have to vote. And that also doesn't seem to be the case. So one thing I wanted to ask you is about how your argument translates to democracy. So I feel like there's a real interesting connection between the 3 arguments that we sort of discussed today, and that you have these low salience types of backsliding and show that they affect public trust in very limited ways. And I'm really interested in this argument. I wonder how well it translates to democracies. I suspect very well, and I suspect it's sort of like a part of this snowball that we're living in right now. And I was wondering if you could just sort of speak to that and the incumbency bias of it all as well.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, for election timing results, our sample is about democracies. So we include like 50 countries from democratic regimes, and we found some the long-term positive impact of election timing on the government trust and parliamentary trust. And yeah, so, but one thing which may be different from, so in democracies, there is institutionalized checks and balances basically in advanced democracies. So they may be more constrained from using some forms of subtle electoral manipulation. So that may make difference between autocracies and democracies. Autocracies have a wider repertories of electoral manipulation, but democracies may be limited by their toolkits that they can deploy. So that's one possible difference. But looking at countries, democratic countries experiencing backsliding, gradually we see some patterns where leaders use the methods that autocratic leaders were previously using. So yeah, impression. Yeah.
Well, so we are at time, but this has really been great. And so hopefully this will convince everyone to go check out the book series, the Emerging Democracies book series online. So you've got some amazing authors in the series. I want to give a really big thanks to Rosa Razmi for putting together everything technically. Everything came off perfectly. Thank you so much for all of that. And thanks Mollie Cohen, Schiumerini, and Masaaki Higashijima for a really tremendous discussion. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.